So we're coming a little closer to home for the next two theses, and then conceptually for the third one, closer to home. So Sarah Gilloran is actually working on a project right outside the door here. And her thesis committee is comprised of Michael Abrams, the chair, Stephen Hurt, and myself, and Sarah. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for being here today. I know it's been a long day, but we're getting to the end. I would first like to take a moment to thank my entire committee, and especially Professor Abrams, for really pushing me throughout this whole process, but offering words of encouragement when those were needed. I'd also like to thank my family and friends for supporting me not only through my thesis, but my entire 6 years of schooling and really getting me to this point. And finally, my studio cohort for all being here and supporting me, welcoming me into Maryland, and making me a better designer as a whole. So with that, I'd like to present to you Consciousness of Design, Transforming the...
Sir, could the folks that are sharing the great space with us please keep your noise to absolute minimum, meaning we'd like to have you whisper or be silent. Thank you very much. Sarah, you may continue with your master's thesis presentation.
No.
There are rude people in here.
Okay, so Consciousness of Design, Transforming the Academic Environment. And with this thesis, I will be proposing a new academic paradigm surrounding architectural education. So obviously this is a topic that resonates for most of us here in this room today. So I'd like to start by asking you all to think back to your own personal academic experiences. I'm sure a lot of similar things come to mind for all of us: designing, critiquing, sketching, pin-ups, model makings. I'm sure a lot of caffeine for everyone. But overall, most of these experiences and educational experiences are surrounded around the studio environment. And whether you remember it or not, or believe it or not, we do have other courses that we learn here. So this thesis begins to question why some of the things we learn within studio carry with us so much more than those outside of the studio environment. So outside of the studio environment and across campus, the typical method of learning is lecture-based learning. And this has been proven to be a very ineffective mode of learning, with an average university student only having about a 20-minute attention span, and therefore they're only able to retain 60 to 70% of the information that's provided to them in a lecture-based learning environment, and are able to reiterate even less than that at a later time. The studio environment, on the other hand, is a much more hands-on learning approach. You're drawing, you're sketching, you're model making, you're even visiting some of the sites that may be pertinent to what you're designing. Really, this is a multisensory experience with education. And as Giovanni Plasma points out in Eyes of the Skin, the integration of imagination and the senses into education not only leads to a more full-bodied learning experience, but also leads to a more full and dignified life. So this not only comes from the curriculum that we're being taught, but also the settings that we're learning within. So obviously, for an architectural student, most of our time is going to be spent in the studio. So that's going to be the place that we learn the most from. So whether it's here in the University of Maryland, looking to the concrete structure to understand how some of that begins to be laid out, or even something as simple as the measurements up along the wall to understand the overall scale of the spaces that we're creating. I also have been able to contrast two different studio environments, having got my undergraduate degree at Roger Williams University. And being inside this building, I really knew which time of the day was better to be on which side of the building, and which spaces felt better to work in, depending on the time of the day. So this really comes from this whole full-bodied envelopment in these built environments. And there's many architects today that are already focusing on these multi-sensory design approaches, such as Peter Zumthor, who's really able to draw this immense amount of texture out of his designs through his different materiality and the way in which the light interacts with these materials. Or even Stephen Hall, who has this amazing ability to interact light with his designs, and even just the sequence through the space, such as the Chapel of St. Ignatius, where you're traveling down a more condensed corridor that eventually opens up to the altar and really creates this spiritual, harmonious sense of light as it descends down onto the altar itself. So all of these things that I'm speaking about are really the experience that you're going to have within the architecture, and that's something that's a little bit hard to quantify. So today, architects are applying the ideas of phenomenology into architectural built environment. This is a very, very broad concept. Essentially, it encompasses any time that the body is playing a role in your perception. So for the purposes of this thesis, I broke this down into 4 of the 5 senses and how those relate to your perception of the built environment. So those being sight, sound, touch, and smell. And furthering that, I began to look at how these absorptions of our environment could become more conscious for architecture students. So how you could begin to analyze your senses through means of sight lines, sound wavelengths, different textures, or even different branding or intensities of smell. So by being able to analyze some of these things, students can begin to make future design decisions. So this not only has to be more heavily incorporated into the academic curriculum itself, but also in those spaces that we're learning within. So the typical classroom setting outside of a studio setting is set up for a lecture-based learning environment. The professor stands at the front of the room, delivers most likely an oral lecture to the class, possibly with some visual aids, and the students all sit parallel to one another, and there's really little opportunity for student-to-student interaction, and even less opportunity for student-to-professor interaction. So in order to really incorporate these hands-on learning and sensory approaches, it becomes necessary to rethink what this classroom should be. So in this proposal, different maker spaces or hands-on learning environments become the classrooms themselves. So things such as the wood shop, where students are really in there using their hands, creating a different opportunity for student-to-student collaboration, and even a different setting for the professor to be interacting with those students. In addition, some of the informal gathering spaces become the classroom as well. So these are spaces where different lectures can still happen, but in a more condensed environment that allows for more collaboration between the students, and it's really just less intimidating for that type of academic setting, or even more of social gathering space, which is something that's often neglected in academic design, but it's really important for the cognitive advancement of students. And finally, this can be used as study space, or students can work on projects together in this space. And this presents different opportunities for things such as, say, some engineering students are sitting on the steps working on their project, and an architecture student walks by and notices that they're working on something that's very similar to something that they're personally interested in, and this will spark an impromptu academic interaction. So that brings me to another point that's somewhat neglected within the architectural academic environment, and that's cross-discipline connection. So there's many disciplines on campus that already use this hands-on learning or knowing in action approach to learning. And different things like music students use perceptual learning techniques to learn different instruments, or art students become really enveloped in the type of projects that they're creating, as well as some disciplines that are more integrated with architecture in the professional world, but not so much in the academic curriculum. So different disciplines such as landscape or engineering are incorporated in a small way, such as the solar decathlon, which has been proven to be widely successful, but is really not incorporated throughout the entire academic curriculum. So this is true also for the physical spaces that those disciplines reside within. So here on the University of Maryland campus, those 5 disciplines that I just mentioned are spread out all across campus and don't really have a central space that allows them to interact on either a formal or informal level. So this led me to begin to look at the University of Maryland as a site for my proposal. While this academic experience can really be applied across any type of architectural curriculum, the University of Maryland has a very strong jumping off point with the strong architecture program and engineering programs, and allows for a really good building point to start implementing this new type of learning system. So with that, I began looking at some of the pros and cons of the campus itself and where it's headed in the future. So this led me to the 2030 Facilities Master Plan. So by the year 2030, this is what the campus is going to look like. It lays out some of the new additions to campus, some of which are already underway, as well as the demolition of some existing buildings and the incorporation of the purple line through the center of campus. So delving a little bit deeper in exactly where this proposal should be located, since architecture students will be the main users of this building, it makes sense to locate the proposal near this building, and it also poses the additional benefit of having the arts building being located just to the north, so there would be ease of accessibility for these students as well. So looking deeper into the 2030 Facilities Master Plan for this particular area of campus, the most important things to note for this proposal being the 2 additions to the existing architecture building, as well as the strong access of Mayor Mall down the center here, and the demolition of Prinkert Hall, which sits right across the mall, and the incorporation of what this plan calls S5, which is going to be a visual Visual Arts and Cultures building. So looking at some of the restrictions and opportunities that come along with this site, first and foremost, Anne Arundel Hall sits directly at the head of this axis, which can be understood through the southern elevation, and acts as a really uniting figure not only for Mayor Mall, but also sits on the axis of McKeldin Mall, and creates two very strong edges along either side of Mayor Mall to respect that access. And in addition to this, creates a really unique opportunity for some cross-access connection and how students will be traveling from the architecture building out into the mall and how that interaction will happen. Finally, this site has a lot of steep topography, which can be understood through the steps as you travel down Mayor Mall. There's about an 11-foot grade change from the northern side of Prinkert Hall to the southern side of Prinkert Hall, which again can be easily understood through the southern elevation as well as some of the sections down the board. So looking back at this area's master plan and looking at where exactly this building should be located, one of the biggest problems with this master plan is this proposal for the addition to the architecture building. It leaves a very small, almost inaccessible interior courtyard space, as well as the overall form of this building does not really lend itself to that type of addition. So with that, I have proposed more of a pavilion space that sits at the head of Mayor Mall and acts as a beacon at the end of the space and physically grows itself out of the topography, and then is connected to an additional building through an underground tunnel that's also realized at site level and allows for this building to sit more aligned with some of the footprint proposed within the 2030 facilities master plan. So whether you're approaching the building from the southern end of Mayor Mall, you really understand this building as a beacon with this glass enclosed space at the head of the mall, while still allowing for the circulation if you're coming from the northern side of Campus Hall to run down through Mayor Mall, but you still understand that these buildings are really connected and you're still invited into each of the spaces. So further approaching the building, as you make your way towards the main entrance of the pavilion, the Maker's Pavilion, you're reminded of some of those sensory qualities that I earlier spoke of. Immediately, your olfactory senses are heightened with more stronger scented native Maryland plants being used along the exterior circulation to act as more of a wayfinding device. And then you're reminded of some of the textural qualities of the building, with some more textured concrete lining the walls as you physically descend down into the space and start to feel the weight of the building above you. As you progress further down into the building, you begin to understand the overall partie of the space as a whole, with some of the denser sensory spaces being located in the northern part of the plan, and then progressing down into more open sensory spaces as you progress down south through the building. So this not only means the overall scale of the space and the amount of light that's integrated, but also the different materiality that is used. So as you travel down these circulation spaces, you're greeted with some warmer wood that's very smooth in texture and allows for a flow of circulation, as well as some smoother concrete, so still helping the user to understand and feel the weight of this building, but smoothing it out a little bit so that it allows for some acoustical reverberation, making the space feel much larger, as well as just providing more of a smooth texture to kind of soften things. So as you progress down through the building, you ultimately arrive at the makerspace, which serves as this very flexible environment to reintegrate some of those hands-on learning techniques that I spoke of earlier. So whether that's one-on-one critiques with your professors or more model making with the students, or even larger scale critiques if that is necessary. From there, you're invited to progress through the underground tunnel, which is located right here, connecting the two buildings together, and also doubles as a gallery space, ultimately arriving at the Maker's Building. So this building follows a similar partie to the Maker's Pavilion, with some more condensed sensory spaces opening up into more light-filled and lighter sensory spaces, with this uniting element of this centralized circulation street that allows you to really understand the more condensed program, opening up into some of the larger maker spaces. So this can be understood through the progression of the section down the building as you travel down that street, as well as through some of the programmatic spaces that exist within these smaller spaces. So the digital fabrication lab or the materials lab would be located in these more condensed sensory spaces. And once again, this not only is progressed through the overall scale of the space, but once again through the different materialities that are used. So in some of the more condensed programmatic spaces, you'll be using different acoustical panels that really work to absorb the sound, or even some different VCT material along the floor that not only absorbs the sound as you walk through it, but really invites people to slow down through the space and really hang out and study and spend more time in these more dense programmatic areas. So overall, the scale of these buildings will allow students that are occupying them to really understand what types of activities and interactions happen in a smaller scale versus a larger scaled space, and how that affects the user's perception of that space, and how being above ground and physically descending down into the space really affects your sensory perception. As well as leaving the structure exposed throughout the entirety of the building will allow for the architecture students to really learn from these different connections and the different opportunities within the structure, and choosing particular trusses and supporting materials that visually cue into members that are in compression being larger and members that are in tension being smaller, so they can really begin to learn from these opportunities. In addition to this, the structure will be following along with the overall partie of the building, with the concrete supporting some of the heavier sensory spaces, and then progressing out into more wood and open spaces as you get to the lighter sensory spaces. So in conclusion, this building will allow for all users of the space to really become in tune with their senses as they travel through, and really have a full-bodied experience with architecture. In addition, the architecture students occupying this building will really be able to learn from these spaces that they're occupying every single day. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and comments.
There are several things here. I'm trying to put them together in a sort of consistent, coherent way. You say that architecture and the studios as spaces were one of the spaces that offer that opportunity to actually have a more fully sensory experience of what learning would be, right?
Correct.
And so, what is that you're trying to do? Are you trying to improve that somehow? Or?
Build off of that curriculum. So a lot of the curriculum surrounding the studio setting isn't necessarily as fulfilling as the studio setting is.
Okay.
So I'm proposing an addition to that curriculum.
Because I'll tell you why. Because there is an overarching theme to what you're doing here, which is the issue of learning. So you're using architecture as an example, but truly, the question of how your experience of learning can be improved by coming out of the conventional spaces of education, it's a problem that is going on everywhere.
Correct.
And if in any place is actually good, is precisely in architecture, as you well pointed out.
Right.
But I understand what you're saying. You know that other part of the curriculum doesn't benefit so clearly about that. That doesn't mean we don't have the spaces to do it. We just don't have the curriculum designed to do it in that way. Okay, so these I'll leave there, but what I'm saying is that the problem of actually creating spaces that will encourage other kind of interactions goes all across. And it poses a very different problem. It poses the problem that perhaps campuses should not be divided according to disciplines, but they should be they should encourage actually interaction between disciplines. So that's what they call breaking silence, breaking up silence. And so if you ask me right now as an architect, you know, how you envision campuses in the future, I don't have a clear image. I have good examples, but I don't have a clear image. But it's clearly away from these kinds of buildings that are devoted to one discipline, and more about how they start interacting to create new kind of experiences and make the whole learning experience more rich. Now you do have an example in this campus that I don't see there. And that to me is like, what? Why is she not showing that? So you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, that building that was just recently completed.
That's right.
Yeah,
What's the name?
The John Edwards, I believe. correct?
So Edward St. John building?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
What do you think about
I
that?
did use that as a precedent because that does contain a lot of the similar spaces to what I'm trying to create. I think in my proposal, the thing that's a little bit different is being more geared towards architecture and engineering students. It really requires a little bit of a different program with different maker spaces like digital fabrication labs and wood shops, but it's the same idea with sort of cross-discipline opportunities for interaction between many different students.
So my issue is precisely what you just mentioned, that I think that the future of that kind of spaces implies that we need to reorganize the way we teach, the way we organize curriculum in a very different way than what we do it now. Now, I understand that's not your job, because you're not an educator, you're not, and there's a lot written about it, and you don't want to be lost. But I don't think it's going to be around our buildings. Like, I mean, these may still be architecture building, but I see these kind of opportunities happening precisely in sort of cross situations where you bring together people from any place. Not necessarily engineering, which is an obvious, and by the way, it's pretty far from us.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. But from any place in that kind of maker spaces. And so I'm not sure that the idea of creating those spaces attached to one of the disciplines that are already there is the right way to go. And that doesn't mean that what you have here can work. It probably could work for more than what you're saying, which is what I would expect. Is it means that I don't think you're describing this, like if you propose a paradigmatic change, then you cannot start from where you are. You are not attaching, you're not adding to architecture, you're actually creating opportunities for another kind of interactions to happen that are not the ones that are happening now in architecture.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's what I was missing here, and I do think that this building is actually a very good example of how, and I'm surprised that actually has been assigned to, I think it's chemical engineer or something?
Yeah, I don't think it's...
Something. But, you know, I've heard that it's associated to, and I would imagine that was a way to actually fund it.
Yeah.
That's right. But not, it's not. I mean, it's a building can be used by anyone, and I would expect that actually in the future, more and more of those buildings are going to start happening. So in a way, what you're doing here is what's going to start happening more and more and more. And of course, you know, you would still have people teaching their things in their buildings, but the most important buildings are not going to be the ones that are defined as schools, but the ones that are actually encouraging these kind of interactions, which is something that is very fussy right now for us.
Yeah.
And I would understand it is for you.
Right.
So I'm not sure I would explain your project the way you explained it.
Okay.
I think that this is a building that could be used by anyone. It happens to be around these ones, and it would encourage these kind of interactions between the buildings that are close by for a logical, strategic reason. But God knows what's going to happen there.
Yeah, I guess I might just not have fully articulated that, but this is meant to be used by many different disciplines, music, art, engineering, landscaping. It's just more based off the architectural curriculum just because that's something I'm really familiar with, and I understand the certain necessities to that program. So branching off of that was easier for me personally.
But I want you to imagine, I mean, there are good examples. Like Media Lab in MIT is exactly that. When it came out of architecture. And I couldn't say it belongs to architecture anymore, to be honest.
Right.
Because it mixes everything. So we are actually heading that way.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but we're heading that way.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I had a little different idea. Although I think it's rooted in the same thing. I thought what you proposed connected most of the arts disciplines, right?
Yeah, essentially.
As well as the architecture.
Correct, essentially, yeah.
But I guess what I think that it would be reinforced more if maybe the architecture building is, I'm assuming that that's on the...
Yeah, that's this building here.
That's right. If that was part of that ensemble, then you could make the argument to support the idea that this is an example that could be used campus-wide. Then I think that it completes what I thought was your initial idea about the studio teaching method being incorporated in other disciplines. You just chose arts to do that, but it could have been used throughout the campus. However, I think without architecture connected to it, I think kind of weakens the argument.
Okay.
Just the thought. So I guess what I'm saying is it should have been rendered together, and maybe the circulation should, that bridge that connects there should have connected with the others, and then the bridge itself maybe becomes that a true bridge. You know, it links the various things together, becomes almost a universal space.
Sitting here trying to figure out how to phrase my comment, and I think I'm still trying to make a connection between the sensory and the actual function, because I think it's just the shell of the space. I think is in my opinion what is integral to the studio culture. I mean, you can go to all different types of studios all across the country, different architecture schools, and you know the studio space from a formal standpoint is essentially roundabout the same. You know, large spaces where people can collaborate, but you chose to render the space and try to attack it from the point of creating these sort of sensory moments, right? And I'm struggling to make the connection between how the sensory enhances the education, the architectural education. Do you have anything that?
I guess the basic idea is sort of a student that can occupy a built environment, they really become part of that environment and they understand it to either make them feel a better way or feel good in that space or not feel good in that space, and that comes a lot from the sensory perception of those spaces. So I was trying to create different sensory opportunities so that students could really begin to understand how their human body interacts with those spaces, and then begin to quantify those aspects through some of the different sensory things that I talked earlier.
So the stone, the way I'm understanding is that the stone is meant to serve as a sort of a feeling texture or a gradient texture that would incite some sort of
Correct.
creative
All the materiality, but yes.
inspiration. And I think there's a stronger, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's a stronger connection that needs to be made there in order to make that argument more connected to what you're trying to do.
Okay.
The way I thought this was going was I immediately thought of this sort of classical Greek way of teaching, where you have a big class and you go out into the open space and it's very flexible. And I think that's a way that there's a couple of schools that are sort of trying to teach in that mode of thinking right now. So I thought that was the way this was sort of going. I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going to see more stuff about the space that you were sort of completing with the integration of these buildings. I actually think the way you've suggested that the building goes into the landscape is quite nice. And not to say anything is wrong, but I just think there's something else that needs to happen in order to make the connection between how this enhances the education. Because I could say that it's very subjective. I could be in this space and the way the light comes in may not incite me to be creative. It may just allow me to relax or whatever. I think that it needs to be more clearly defined. Even though I like it, Peter Zumthor's Walls is one of my favorite projects ever. But even in that space, it's not meant to incite the working. It's meant to relax. And I'm sure people have different opinions about that, but the connection is lost for me.
Okay. I guess just to point to one of the points that you brought up, the idea that it's subjective is kind of okay within this structure. And same thing with, there's certain spaces in studio that everyone's going to love to work, or there's certain spaces that only particular people are going to like to work, but they're still going to draw from those architectural experiences and connections that they have with those spaces and allow that to make future design decisions.
really strong verbal presentation, and I'm really enjoying these process sketches, and I'm kind of, it's a little bit similar to the last project where it seems like it may be in a little bit of in-between zone. I mean, I like the idea of this kind of building as a connector that kind of buries itself in the site and allows, it's almost like a ha-ha wall, you know, those are, where you can kind of see in one direction, but it reveals itself in the other, or the pyramid by William Kent, where, you know, so, and then presenting this kind of new model in juxtaposition to or in relationship to the architectural school. I think is really kind of setting up a strong dialogue and letting the kind of connective piece kind of be more in the kind of background. And so I'm curious about why you chose to objectify or at least celebrate this one aspect of I guess it's the makerspace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In this kind of mall that you created. And I'm sorry, I don't understand the axis that you're talking about. I don't know if the building is right in the center or if it's off to one side. But maybe you could just talk about that relationship.
Okay, yeah, the building, it's easiest to understand in the southern elevation. You can see Anne Arundel Hall is that building that's located at the top of the cupola. So it does sit right on the center axis of Mayor Mall. So right up, it would be straight up the top there. But the idea of breaking that edge a little bit with the makerspace was really a programmatic choice to really highlight what this building is going to be doing with its makerspaces and collaborative learning environments. And then therefore enclosing this space in glass really allows it to act as a beacon at the head of the mall, but still not totally breaking that access connected to Anne Arundel Hall and still respecting that access.
And that building is facing south?
Correct, yeah.
And then the others are facing west?
Correct, yep.
Okay. I mean, it's a little, I guess I understand that. I guess I wouldn't have ramped the brick up the side where the stair goes up.
Yeah.
Maybe just letting the retaining wall kind of do its thing in order to let the landscape be a more clear kind of flow from top to bottom. By taking the brick up there, it kind of creates a dialogue. Yeah. And then I'm just wondering about, I mean, obviously you have these two other important kind of spaces in the other building, and yet they have a strange, it's not clear to me what their relationship is to one another in a formal or proportional sense, and what their relationship is, again, in dialogue with buildings either across the mall.
The two larger scale makerspaces, you're speaking about these two spaces.
Yes.
So I guess that's probably easiest to understand through the roof plan. You actually progress into one of these larger scale makerspaces as the main entry of the building, so that's what connects these two spaces together with that underground tunnel. So that would be this approach down from underneath. And then one of the makerspaces acts as a more flexible environment, similar to the space that we're in now, where different things, activities can happen within that, and the other acts as the wood shop, so a little bit more programmatic makerspace with particular equipment located within these spaces. And that one's proportionately larger, just based upon some of the needs of this particular school. Our wood shop is definitely undersized for what we currently need, so proposing something that's much larger than that was the reasoning behind that.
I mean, light is such a big issue from in terms of phenomenology and our experience of space, and I guess in terms of the research you did into materiality is really interesting, and then the oral aspect of that with the sound that's made as you kind of walk through a space. I think the quality of light and to really try and work with that a little bit more to kind of create a greater variety or greater consciousness of light in terms of how you experience it as you move through these buildings would have been interesting to kind of work with, and particularly where you have these two spaces that are so similar. They're almost the same, but they're not quite. Just wondering if there could be different proportions, different structural systems, different materiality to them. They're both kind of expressed as a structure that sits within the larger structure. And, I just think it sets up this kind of, there's this tripartite composition where clearly this one is left out.
Okay.
And so it's like you're trying to do a lot with this. You're trying to make the space here, you're trying to articulate a space here, you're trying to celebrate this here, and you're trying to make a space up here that is kind of related to that space, but not really. And so I think it's that kind of maybe trying to do a little bit too much with that one piece. So that's where, I think maybe just a clearer role. I agree with the idea of celebrating that space, but I'm not sure that it needs to be in the same language as these other two that we've already got going, even though it's a different pitch.
So Sarah, I'm so glad that you took this on. And the heck of it is that this space is, on a personal note, let me just call it a personal pet. What are we calling this? This is a mall. What are we calling this mall? Does it have a name?
The Mayor Mall?
The Mayor Mall.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's not really a mall, It is currently defined by corporate university architecture, right? Which gives us, in my personal opinion, very little psychic return. We've talked about this mall most of the day. So I'm very glad you took this project on, not for a couple of reasons. One is the head of this mall, I think, is a tremendous opportunity for academic buildings devoted to precisely the disciplines that you're proposing here. So just a couple of things. So when the great shining moment comes, when the $150 million is finally assembled, right, to create a substantial new building for the design disciplines on this campus, I suspect that this site is going to be prime real estate. But the one thing about your presentation, there's so much to like about the spaces that you've developed, and they exhibit a wonderful tectonic quality, great sensitivity to material selection and proportion. So I'm very, I just enjoy looking at the spaces. But in terms of the site response, and in getting ready for that $150 million moment, right, the one thing that we have to confront are the buildings that are, blank
The arts building.
here,
Yeah.
right? We all know what period that was designed for, and this building here. So there's and there are other buildings, Prince Frederick Hall, that define other parts of the mall. So I think the litmus test is really drawing those buildings and kind of confronting what, in the aggregate, the campus is actually offering us. And it's a very challenging thing indeed to take on a site like this and begin to negotiate the languages that are in evidence. So if I look at your elevation up there, you've appropriated a kind of iconic, what you have defined, I think, as a sort of iconic element. That is the end wall of Anne Arundel Hall. But I think as you sort of contemplate this project and think about it moving forward in your mind, think about how the architecture and the site response, could make that kind of definitive moment on the campus, because it truly is a portal to the future in a way. So, and I think the key to that is kind of holding your feet to the fire on what is actually defining that space architecturally at this point. And so the question I would have is, does the language of what you proposed, is that going to hold its own in this environment?
Yeah, I guess just to speak that a little bit, the main idea of the form of that building was to follow along with some of the forms that are already present within campus, but sort of apply some new materiality choices to them to kind of bring in a more modern element.
I actually like Merrill Mall. I think it's actually one of the few places on campus where the landscape actually rises to an adequate level. So I have no problem with the landscape or the pathwork of Merrill Mall. I think it's not a question either of style of the buildings around it. The buildings are, they're post-World War II, and so naturally we expect them to be rather vacuous in terms of their ability to convey any message. So to me, it's more the massing and more the ability of the buildings to make edge. I mean, I think if we plant well enough, we won't have to look at them. And if those trees grow as they are growing, we'll just cover up the Smith School so you won't see that. This building as well doesn't really operate very well as an edge building on the mall. I mean, it wouldn't operate as an edge building on any space. It was never thought to be a space-making building. So the degree to which you could extend an edge along the western edge of the mall would be helpful. But I think the question I have in mind, I've had it all along, is, and somebody brought up the question about Anne Arundel Hall, is that what precisely about Anne Arundel Hall is actually on the axis of this Merrill Mall. And even right now, the diagrams don't really fully show that. And I would think you would want to think about creating diagrams that show how you make edges, how you make thresholds, and what actually anchors center is going to be important as a way to kind of hone and refine the issue of further developing the architectural edges, the walls, and the thresholds to the space. Steve, I didn't realize you had your hand up. So you're the last one.
Yes, sir. Just so you know, I am on this committee. But I'm a latecomer to the committee. I've only seen the project twice. And that's been, what, in the last couple of months? Right?
Yep.
So anyway, a lot of this is new to me. I think a couple of things strike me. One, this building here, which at one level I think has been your principal preoccupation, actually, is really what you guys are talking about. It's the building that has a program to be the, what do we call it, the maker space, be all, art, everybody, whatever building. And completely separate from anything that would happen with architecture. So, your reference about, how much money did you say? 150 million or whatever.
150 million.
So, 150 million over here, or maybe, another 20 or something over here. The two things are really fundamentally independent of each other. And in a programmatic sense, currently with regard to the campus. And so in her presentation, I think, at one level, this thing, the connector piece, is a bit of a confusion in terms of what the actual overall sort of intention, that you've taken the idea and said, wouldn't it be great if we could kind of connect these things together? But it ends up being a little at least in terms of the understanding of the presentation, a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, situation. And the other thing had to do with your sort of primary phenomenological aspect of things, where you put quite a bit of energy into, going down into the ground, and then in this tight space and coming out into this, big open, glassy, whatever. And I think the other part having to do with the energy that's apparent to me. I'm sitting over here. So you guys are sitting way down there. I'm sitting over here. And so I have the advantage of looking at the drawings that are over here, which is where I think actually most of the architecture is, that she's actually describing, which is pretty terrific. I see very interesting structure in terms of the comment that she made about the contrast between tension elements and compression elements. I can almost hear this building moving in the wind, as a result of the careful technology applied over here. So I started to be a believer in what I would learn as an architect student occupying these spaces. It's, Kelly's in the way. And I would invite you towards the end of this thing, at the end, to come down and look at all this stuff,
Well, this is the end.
I know, who do I give it to? Oh, I give it to you.
I got share. Very good comments, actually. And I agree with Professor Hurt. I mean, you have a lot of great work here, especially towards the end, that I don't think I can see on the way down here, but I think you provided a platform in which we have cross-pollination between art, architecture students, music students, so they can actually, kind of like learn from each other. And that's something that in architecture school, and which in a lot of fields, you're isolated. Mm-hmm. So you provided a canvas, a type of platform for that to occur. So I think that's commendable and admirable. The idea that you're using and refining the interiors and thinking about how people feel and touch and experience those interior materials, I think is critical to the habitable space that sometimes we forget. As architects, we just do a shell and forget about the interior. So I commend you for that. I think at that level of quality and sophistication. And some of these are really exquisite drawings and really talks about texture and habitable spaces. And I can see myself like being in those bigger spaces. So then we talk about the use of the wood shop and use it as a type of platform to learn. I think that's also very admirable. Questioning the curriculum in that sense, I think that's something that we have to think about, as faculty, and applaud you for that. It's been a pleasure having you as a student, and good luck in your future endeavors. Thank you.